Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take those really complex security issues you send us, we crack them open, and try to give you the essential knowledge you need to, well, understand them properly. Today we're tackling a big one, a really deep dive into the ultimate strategic dilemma, nuclear proliferation, specifically in the 21st century. You've shared just a stack of incredibly dense, really crucial source material with us. I'm thinking particularly of the work by analysts like Gerald Marsh and Theodore Postel. They really go beyond the headlines, don't they? They look at everything from, well, the Cold War origins to some pretty irrational force planning, all the way to the very specific real-world engineering challenges facing, modern nuclear players,
Yeah.
especially North Korea.
Yeah.
That's absolutely right. And when you pull all these sources together, a pretty clear picture starts to emerge. Basically, the traditional ways we've tried to manage this threat, mainly the nonproliferation treaty, the NPT, they just seem fundamentally inadequate for the world we're living in now. So our mission today in this deep dive is to really unpack why. Why do nations see getting the bomb, the nuclear option, as a rational move geopolitically? We also need to look hard at the technical reality. What's the actual threat from countries like North Korea? We're going to dive deep into the specs of their weapons, their missiles. And then finally, we want to explore some, frankly, radical policy alternatives, ones that are scientifically sound, mind you, that really challenge the current pretty dangerous status quo.
Okay, but before we jump right into the technical stuff, we really have to acknowledge just how serious this topic is. I mean, nuclear war. It's a potential catastrophe that's almost impossible to truly comprehend. And yet, there's this central question that keeps coming up. Why do countries still want these weapons when, five major powers, the US, Russia, China, France, the UK, already have more than enough firepower to deter any huge conventional war?
It seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? But the answer really is because those global powers use their nuclear capability. It's leverage. It's a kind of geopolitical coercion. For developing nations, the bomb isn't really seen as a weapon to use. It's more like the ultimate insurance policy for national sovereignty. To understand that, we really have to start by looking back at the trauma that, created the nuclear age in the first place.
Okay, yeah, let's unpack that history. Because understanding how we even got to this level of existential threat, that context is absolutely crucial. When most people think about the end of World War II, they immediately think, scale of destruction equals the atomic bombs. And the war itself, killed around 80 million people, just a staggering number. But Marsh, in the source material, he brings up this really stunning paradox about those final months of the war in the Pacific. Between March and July 45, the U.S. dropped something like 100,000 tons of conventional incendiaries, firebombs, on over 60 Japanese cities. The sources estimate this campaign alone killed maybe 500,000, maybe over 1 million people, and left 10 to 20 million homeless.
Now, just compare that single campaign to the atomic bombings. Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined caused an estimated 350,000 casualties, and that includes people who died later from radiation sickness. So just by the raw numbers casualties, people displaced the conventional firebombing was statistically, far more devastating.
Okay, so if the conventional bombs killed more people, what's the aha moment here? What are the sources driving at? Why do we remember Hiroshima so vividly? And why did it fundamentally change what war meant?
Right. We remember Hiroshima because it was the start, the beginning of an era where, frankly, modern civilization couldn't guarantee its own survival if an all-out war happened again. The key difference wasn't just the death toll, it was the speed and the concentration of the destruction. Delivering those 100,000 tons of incendiaries, that took 6 months. Continuous effort, hundreds of planes, huge logistics, delivering the power to destroy a city with a nuclear weapon. One plane, one bomb, one single moment. It created this technological reality, this imperative that suddenly made the horror of any future major conflict just unimaginable.
And this technological leap, it just propelled us straight into the age of overkill, didn't it? The U.S. and the Soviets building these arsenals with thousands and thousands of warheads, when, in reality, maybe a few dozen would have been enough for complete mutual destruction. How did we end up building such an insane, almost illogical stockpile?
Well, that takes us right into David Riesenberg's really important 1983 study, The Origins of Overkill. He dug into the Cold War targeting criteria, and what he found was deeply disturbing. The Strategic Air Command, SAC, had set up this methodology that the Navy actually kept objecting to, particularly how they calculated the necessary yield the bomb power needed. For instance, the Navy pointed out that SAC's math required assigning something like 300 to 500 kilotons of nuclear yield just to assure damage equivalent to the 13-kiloton bomb dropped on Hiroshima.
Wait, 3 to 500 kilotons to match 13?
Yeah. Think about that. You needed 20 to 30 times the actual power just to make the targeting calculation come out right, to assure success according to their models.
That seems completely disconnected from reality. What was the flaw? The critical flaw in their thinking?
The critical flaw, and this is the part that's actually still relevant today, which is terrifying, is that the methodology treated nuclear weapons basically as just large sticks of dynamite. They calculated destruction almost purely based on blast pressure, overpressure. They almost completely ignored the massive secondary effects.
Like what?
Like the thermal radiation that just incinerates everything, the firestorms that inevitably follow, and critically, the induced radioactivity. All those combined effects make the destructive footprint massively bigger, but they were largely just left out of the main calculation.
Wow. So the result was force planning, driven by this incredibly limited primary effects only model.
Yeah.
And that led to just sheer absurdity, right?
Absolutely. Rosenberg noted that SAC's criteria ended up assigning many tens of weapons just to targets along the Moscow Beltway.
Tens of weapons for just the Beltway.
Yeah. More than enough firepower to literally reduce the area to a sheet of glass. That was a phrase the planners themselves actually used.
And all that immense cost, that constantly spiraling arms race.
Yeah.
That brings us to arms control, doesn't it?
Right. But maybe not in the way most people think about it.
Yeah, exactly. We tend to look back at agreements like SALT and START as these big steps towards disarmament. But that wasn't really their main purpose, was it?
Not at all. They were really the other side of the force planning coin, you could say. Their goal wasn't to get rid of nukes. It was to establish a stable, quantifiable threat level, and maybe just as importantly, to save billions of dollars by stopping the arms race from just spiraling completely out of anyone's control.
The 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the ABM Treaty, that's probably the clearest example of this logic.
Definitely. The sources explain it really well. Imagine if both the U.S. and the Soviets deployed an ABM system, a missile defense system, that was only, say, 50% effective against incoming warheads. What happens? Both sides just double their offensive missiles to guarantee they can still overwhelm the defense and maintain mutual destruction.
So you end up spending twice as much money.
To achieve the exact same strategic outcome, mutual vulnerability. The ABM treaty actually benefited both sides by just taking these hugely expensive defensive systems off the table because they only served to accelerate the offensive race anyway.
But this stability, this whole structure of massive stockpiles and mutual vulnerability, it rested on this incredibly dangerous operational policy dictated by the technology itself. Launch on warning.
Absolutely crucial point. The problem really lies with the land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, the ICBMs. They're often called the vulnerable leg of the nuclear triad. These missiles, they sit in fixed silos. They couldn't survive a nuclear first strike. So the policy had to be, you must launch them the moment you get a warning of an incoming attack, before any actual nuclear detonations confirm it's real.
Which means you're relying entirely on automated systems, satellites, radar, and some incredibly high-pressure human judgment calls.
Exactly, hair-trigger judgment.
And when you rely on systems designed to detect an attack within minutes, well, you open the door to absolutely catastrophic errors. The sources mention a couple of really chilling examples, don't they? Showing just how thin that margin for error really was.
They do. There was that U.S. incident where someone accidentally left a training tape running in the main warning computer. It simulated a massive Soviet launch, which was then seemingly confirmed by radar systems.
Wow.
Luckily, political tensions happened to be relatively low at that moment, so people questioned it, they double-checked, and they found the glitch before it went too far.
But the really terrifying one was in the Soviet Union, September 1983.
Yes. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov. Their automated satellite surveillance system detected multiple incoming U.S. ICBMs. The protocol, the nuclear counterstrike procedure, dictated an immediate response. Launch everything. But Petrov, he looked at the data. It seemed ambiguous. Only 5 missiles detected, not the hundreds they expected in a full first strike. He made this incredible solitary judgment call. He decided it had to be a system malfunction.
And he refused to trigger the counterstrike.
He refused. If he had just followed the protocol, well, like you said, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about it.
It's just staggering how often we came close to annihilation, not because someone wanted war, but because of technology failing, or
Yeah.
just human error under unimaginable pressure.
Exactly. And the key takeaway from all this history, it's really critical for understanding the threat today. That bipolar world, US versus Soviet Union, for all its dangers and its hair trigger policies, it actually had a type of structural stability defined by mutual caution, the ABM treaty logic, that specific bipolar stability. It's gone now. We're in a much more complex multipolar world. But, and this is the crucial part, the instability that's inherent in those vulnerable land-based missiles, the very thing that drove that dangerous launch on warning policy. That instability still exists today in the arsenals of all the major powers.
Okay, so let's use that lingering instability as a bridge. The Cold War stability, such as it was, is gone. Now we have this proliferation environment where dozens of countries technically could build a bomb relatively quickly if they decided to. We need to look at the rational reasons why developing nations might actually seek nukes today. The sources seem to highlight two main drivers.
That's right. The first one is basically regional deterrence. Getting the bomb to balance out or even defeat a local rival who has superior conventional forces. Think Pakistan deterring India. The second reason, and this one's arguably more powerful, is deterring the big players, mainly the U.S., from interfering in their domestic affairs or their regional neighborhood.
And you could trace that second motive way back, can't you? There's historical trauma involved. China's initial push for a nuclear program, it wasn't really about the Soviets at first. It was about deterring what they saw as U.S. nuclear blackmail.
Exactly. It stemmed directly from President Eisenhower's threat back in 1953. He threatened to use nuclear weapons against North Korea and China if necessary to break the stalemate in the Korean War. China saw that as totally unacceptable coercion.
And that historical lesson, that fear, it got powerfully reinforced decades later, didn't it? The first Gulf War.
Oh, absolutely. The sheer speed and overwhelming success of U.S. conventional forces against Iraq in 1991 sent this unmistakable, frankly chilling message to a lot of developing nations. It highlighted just how vulnerable states were if they didn't have nuclear weapons.
It really crystallized the hard choice for many countries. The sources quote that Indian defense minister, reportedly anyway, who said after the Gulf War, "Don't fight the United States unless you have nuclear weapons."
And that quote right there, it basically provides the single most rational justification for proliferation you can find in the 21st century. If you have the bomb, the argument goes, you're essentially untouchable by the world's most powerful military.
Which leads us to, okay, how do they do it? The nuclear proliferators toolkit. We tend to think, maybe because of the U.S. Manhattan Project story, that proliferators have to follow the most high-tech path. But that's not true, is it?
Not at all. That's a very U.S.-centric assumption. Proliferators actually choose all sorts of diverse paths, often simpler ones. It really depends on what materials they can get, what their domestic tech base looks like, and crucially, cost. It's not always about sophistication.
Can you give us a couple of examples of that diversity?
Sure, look at India. They got their plutonium by recycling spent fuel from a CANDU reactor. The beauty of CANDU for them was that it uses natural uranium, which is relatively easy to get. It doesn't require complex enrichment facilities up front. Or Iraq. After Israel bombed their French-supplied Osirak research reactor back in 1981, did they give up? No. They went down multiple paths at once to try and get fissile material, including trying to master these old, almost antique electromagnetic separators called calutrons.
Calutrons, like from the 1940s.
Exactly. The point is, if the political will is strong enough, they will find a pathway, even if it's technologically challenging or unconventional.
That's fascinating. And what about the choice of material? Plutonium versus highly enriched uranium, HEU. Why is plutonium, the poober route, often preferred now, even though it needs much trickier implosion physics to detonate?
Yeah, it seems backwards, right? HEU is simpler to make explode. You just need a basic gun-type design, like the Hiroshima bomb. But the amount of HEU you need for a critical mass is huge, physically large and heavy. That makes it really impractical for putting on smaller missiles. Plutonium, on the other hand, while it needs that complex implosion and you have to reprocess spent reactor fuel to get it, which is dangerous, it lets you build much smaller, lighter warheads. Warheads suitable for miniaturization, for putting on ballistic missiles.
So the end goal dictates the material choice.
Precisely. And paradoxically, the raw materials for plutonium spent fuel from almost any reactor are actually easier for a determined state to obtain than weapons-grade HEU, which requires those massive, expensive, easily detectable enrichment facilities.
Okay, this brings us right to the heart of the problem we face today. The fundamental flaw baked into the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT itself. What's the major loophole that countries like North Korea have been able to, well, drive a truck through?
The major flaw, it's written right there in Article 4 of the treaty. It grants every signatory nation the inalienable right to develop a full nuclear fuel cycle for peaceful purposes. Energy independence, research, medicine. It sounds perfectly reasonable on the surface,
Yeah.
but, as the sources point out, giving nations the right to master uranium enrichment and plutonium reprocessing, even for peaceful reasons, essentially gives them a legal technological license to build weapons pretty much whenever they decide they want to.
So you sign the treaty, you get access to all the sensitive technology and training legally.
You build up the infrastructure, the expertise.
And then if you decide you want the bomb, you just withdraw from the treaty, give your notice, and you've already overcome the biggest technical hurdles.
Exactly. North Korea is the absolute textbook example. They used the access the NPT gave them, built what they needed, and then, in 2003, they legally withdrew after giving the required notice. The treaty basically provided them the ladder they needed to climb out.
That just seems fundamentally broken. So this issue really demands a pretty radical policy solution. The sources actually suggest amending the NPT itself. What would that look like? And what's the necessary political trade-off?
Well, the argument from experts like Marsh is that the NPT has to be amended. You need to eliminate that inalienable right for any nation to develop its own full fuel cycle capability, enrichment, and reprocessing.
That's a huge ask politically, a massive delegation of sovereignty.
It absolutely is, which is why the trade-off has to be equally massive and credible. It would require a robust, formal, international guarantee from the existing nuclear powers. The idea is to establish some kind of internationally controlled entity, maybe call it a global fuel bank. This entity would formally guarantee reliable fuel supplies for civilian reactors and also handle the safe disposal of spent fuel and waste for any nation that agrees to forego its own domestic enrichment and reprocessing capabilities.
So you get the benefits of nuclear energy without the proliferation risk.
That's the goal. It removes the national security incentive for developing enrichment while still preserving the right to peaceful nuclear power. But without tackling that incentive structure, without closing that huge legal loophole in Article 4, the NPT essentially continues to act as a technology incubator, an enabler for nuclear breakout.
Okay, let's apply this framework now to, well, probably the most acute proliferation challenge we face in the 21st century, North Korea. We really need to do a proper technical deep dive into what they've actually achieved. Let's start with their fissile material, their stockpile. The sources spend quite a bit of time making a distinction between different grades of plutonium.
Yes, and this is a really crucial technical point. We often just hear the term weapons-grade plutonium, which is mostly the isotope Pu-239. But the alternative, which you get from power reactors if you leave the fuel in too long, is reactor-grade plutonium. Reactor-grade has a much higher concentration of a heavier isotope, plutonium-240. And the problem with Pu-240 is that it undergoes spontaneous fission. It spits out neutrons all by itself without needing an external trigger.
Okay, what does that mean if you try to build a bomb with it?
It means you run smack into the fissile problem. Those stray neutrons from the Pu-240 can start the nuclear chain reaction too early, before the conventional explosives have fully compressed the plutonium core to maximum density.
So the bomb goes off, but weakly.
Exactly. The yield gets dramatically reduced. What should have been, say, a 20 kiloton explosion might only fizzle out at maybe 1 kiloton or even less. To overcome this pre-detonation problem and get a reliable yield from reactor-grade plutonium, you need incredibly sophisticated, perfectly spherical implosion physics. It's much, much harder to weaponize successfully.
Got it. So focusing on North Korea, their main source has been the Yongbyon reactor, right?
Mm-hmm.
What kind of plutonium did that produce, and what are the stockpile estimates?
Right. The Yongbyon 25 megawatt thermal reactor. It's a graphite-moderated production reactor, meaning it was primarily designed to make plutonium efficiently, not really generate useful electricity. Based on its operating history, Marsh calculates that by around 2017, North Korea is estimated to have produced somewhere between 42 and 60 kilograms of weapons-grade plutonium. Pretty good stuff, low in Pu-240.
Okay, 42 to 60 kilograms total produced. Now, they've done nuclear tests. How much does that leave them?
Well, assuming their first 5 tests each used roughly, say, 4 kilograms of plutonium, which is a reasonable estimate for a first-generation device. That would mean they had somewhere between 22 and 40 kilograms remaining in their stockpile as of 2017.
And what does that translate to in terms of actual weapons?
Enough for maybe 5 to 9 simple first-generation nuclear bombs or the fission primaries needed for more advanced weapons.
Their testing record itself tells quite a story, doesn't it? 6 tests up to 2017. The yields weren't consistent at first, but they generally increased over time. What does that progression tell us?
It tells us they were learning and improving, specifically with the conventional high explosive part of the bomb. That's the really complex system of precisely shaped charges needed to symmetrically crush the plutonium core and initiate the chain reaction.
Right.
They started really low. Their first test in 2006 was probably a partial failure, maybe less than 1 kiloton yield. Then it climbed 5 kilotons in 2009, steadily up to around 24 kilotons by 2016. That steady increase showed they were getting better and better at mastering that complex implosion engineering.
But then came September 2017. That test was different. A massive jump in yield, up to around 120 kilotons, maybe more. What did that prove?
That proved they had cracked it. They had successfully detonated a two-stage device. That's the fundamental design of a true thermonuclear weapon, a hydrogen bomb.
Explain that. 2 stages.
Yeah. Basically, you use a smaller standard fission bomb, the primary stage, to generate the intense heat and pressure needed to ignite a second, separate stage containing fusion fuel, like lithium deuteride. That fusion stage releases enormous energy. That single 2017 test with that huge yield, it signaled that North Korea had graduated. They'd gone beyond basic fission bombs and had successfully demonstrated mastery of multi-stage thermonuclear designs.
Okay, so they have the yield. They can make a big bang underground, but that's only half the battle, right? What's the massive challenge they still face in actually turning that into a weapon they can deliver on a missile?
It's really a triple challenge: miniaturization, ruggedization, and the re-entry vehicle, the RV.
That goes down.
Okay, first, miniaturization. You have to shrink that tested device down so it physically fits inside the nose cone of a missile, which has strict size and weight limits. Second, ruggedization. The warhead's internal components, the electronics, the explosives, the fissile core itself, have to be tough enough to withstand the incredible G-forces and vibrations of a rocket launch and flight through space. And third, the re-entry vehicle. You need a sophisticated nose cone, an RV, that can protect the warhead as it slams back into the atmosphere at incredible speed and survive the intense heat and deceleration forces without breaking up or burning up.
So a successful underground test is one thing.
It's a huge political statement and a technical milestone, absolutely, but actually achieving a reliable, deliverable warhead that can survive the whole flight and detonate accurately, that's a whole different level of engineering challenge.
Okay, let's switch to the delivery system then. Their rockets. The story there seems to start with them relying heavily on old but very reliable Russian designs from the 50s and 60s,
Yeah,
like the SCUD engine.
that's right. Their early missiles, the SCUD variants, the Nodong, they were basically derived from those workhorse Soviet-era motors. North Korea showed some ingenuity in stretching the airframes, modifying guidance, maybe strapping stages together, like in the Taepodong-1, which used an old surface-to-air missile motor for an upper stage. But the performance was limited by that older engine technology.
But then, Postal identifies something that completely changed the game for them. A real technological leap.
Yes, it was the sudden appearance and their successful integration of a much more powerful family of rocket motors, the RD-250.
RD-250, what's special about those?
These engines use highly energetic, but also highly toxic hypergolic propellants, UDMH fuel, and NTO oxidizer. They ignite on contact, simplifying engine design, but more importantly, they provide way more thrust and efficiency compared to the older kerosene nitric acid SCUD type engines. This was a massive step up in performance.
And this wasn't something they developed themselves.
Almost certainly not. Postal argues, very convincingly, I think, that this technology, likely entire engines or key components, was probably obtained through, as he puts it, vast shipments during the chaos and economic collapse of the Soviet Union in the late 80s and early 90s.
So illicit procurement.
It looks that way. And the transfers might not have even come directly from the main Russian missile design bureaus like Makayev. They could have come from other places, maybe NPO Energomash, potentially even sources in Ukraine, which inherited a lot of Soviet hardware. This wasn't gradual evolution. It was a sudden acquisition that just dramatically boosted their payload-to-range capability almost overnight.
And the culmination of using this RD-250 technology, plus their own integration skills, is the Hwasong 15 ICBM. Can you describe that missile?
The Hwasong 15 is a beast. It's a large two-stage liquid-fueled ICBM. Its first stage uses a variant with two RD-250 thrust chambers working together. And the crucial second stage, the sources note, is dimensionally very close to the upper stage of the old Soviet SS-11 ICBM. This really shows their ability to integrate these powerful, large, long-range components into a working system.
Okay, so when you model the performance of the Hwasong 15, using these high-energy RD-250 motors, what are the sobering conclusions about its reach? Can it hit the U.S. mainland? And what kind of payload can it carry?
The performance calculations are pretty stark. Postal's analysis, which is very detailed, shows this missile definitely has the necessary throw weight. It can likely deliver a payload of around 800 to 850 kilograms all the way to the Washington, D.C. area.
800 kilos to D.C.
Yeah. Or it could carry an even heavier payload, maybe 1,300 kilograms to somewhere like Hawaii or Alaska. There's really no question, based on the physics and the hardware we've seen, that the Hwasong 15 is a genuine intercontinental ballistic missile. It has the range to hit the entire continental United States.
Right, so we've established they have the range with the Hwasong 15. We've established they likely have the thermonuclear yield after the 2017 test. But this brings us right back to that huge, possibly still unproven technical hurdle, getting the warhead back through the atmosphere.
Exactly, the reentry problem.
What does the warhead absolutely need to achieve to survive that reentry and actually be a credible threat to, say, D.C.?
Okay, two key things based on Postal's physics calculations. First, the entire warhead package, the nuclear device itself, plus its heat shield and internal structure. It probably needs to weigh 650 kilograms or less to fit the Hwasong 15's likely performance envelope for hitting the East Coast. But second, and this is the really hard part, that warhead and its reentry vehicle must be able to survive the absolutely brutal deceleration forces as it slams back into the atmosphere from space. We're talking forces potentially up to 60 Gs, 60 times the force of gravity on a steep ICBM trajectory.
60 Gs. I can barely imagine that. What does surviving that actually mean in terms of engineering and materials?
It's an enormous materials science and engineering challenge. You're hitting the atmosphere at maybe Mach 20 or more. The RV experiences incredible shear stresses. The heat generated is intense, requiring special ablative materials that burn away in a controlled manner to dissipate the heat without the structure failing underneath. 60 Gs is enough to crush poorly designed internal components, maybe even disrupt the precisely machined plutonium core or the conventional explosives needed for detonation. It demands an incredibly rugged, likely near-spherical implosion design that's been thoroughly tested and validated under those kinds of stresses.
And that capability, building both the sophisticated RV that can take the heat and the G-forces, and ensuring the nuclear package inside survives and functions, that's the part North Korea hasn't definitively proven yet.
That seems to be the consensus from the technical analyses, yes. They haven't demonstrably flown a realistic warhead shape on a full ICBM trajectory and recovered it, or shown telemetry proving it survived re-entry intact. It's the single biggest remaining technical question mark. And it's that uncertainty, really, that provides perhaps a narrow window of time.
Okay, so that technical calculation, the proven engine power versus the unproven re-entry vehicle, it buys some time. Maybe. But it doesn't really solve the underlying geopolitical problem, does it? And as we shift from the purely technical back to the geopolitical, we run into this really strange paradox that the sources highlight. In certain regions, nuclear proliferation seems to have actually enhanced strategic stability, not destroyed it.
It's deeply counterintuitive, but the historical evidence is there. The classic example is Israel's long-standing policy of nuclear ambiguity, the so-called bomb in the basement. This policy was essentially codified back in 1969 in a quiet understanding between President Nixon and Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir. The deal was, the U.S. would officially turn a blind eye to Israel's nuclear development as long as Israel made no visible introduction of the weapons, meaning no public declarations and, critically, no testing. The ambiguity itself became the deterrent.
But that ambiguity was seriously challenged, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Tell us about the Vela satellite incident in 1979.
Right. September 1979. A U.S. Vela surveillance satellite, designed specifically to detect nuclear explosions, picked up the characteristic double flash of a low-yield atmospheric nuclear test over the South Atlantic or Indian Ocean. Now, the U.S. government officially convened a panel which concluded it probably wasn't a nuclear test, maybe a meteoroid hitting the satellite or something.
But the other data?
Exactly. The signal was independently corroborated by other highly sensitive systems. The giant Arecibo radio telescope in Puerto Rico detected a specific ionospheric disturbance consistent with a nuclear test. And the U.S. Navy's underwater SOSUS hydrophone network picked up a sound signature matching a small nuclear explosion. Yet, to preserve the policy of ambiguity, to uphold that mix-and-mare understanding and avoid a massive diplomatic crisis, successive U.S. administrations basically chose to ignore or actively downplay this compelling intelligence.
They understood that confirming an Israeli test would have triggered huge international pressure, maybe sanctions, and could have badly destabilized the Middle East.
That seems to have been the calculation. Maintaining the ambiguity, even in the face of strong evidence, was seen as less risky than confirming the reality and dealing with the fallout. The ambiguity was the policy.
So what's the historical result of decades of this ambiguous deterrence? This is where the first stability paradox comes in, and it's pretty astonishing when you look at the data.
It is. If you look at the history of major Israeli-Arab wars, particularly the large-scale coalition wars like 67 or 73, since that apparent unacknowledged Israeli test in 1979, the number of those kinds of massive coordinated conventional assaults against Israel has been exactly zero.
Zero.
Zero. That's the crucial data point referencing Table 10.1 in Marsh's work. The introduction of the nuclear option, even a deliberately ambiguous one, essentially seems to have taken the option of a full-scale conventional coalition war off the table for Israel's neighbors. The potential costs, the risk of nuclear retaliation just became too high.
Okay. And we see a similar dynamic, though much more openly acknowledged, in the nuclear triangle involving China, India, and Pakistan and South Asia.
Absolutely. India's motivation to develop the bomb was very clearly a direct response to China testing its first device back in 1964. That Chinese test came just 2 years after India had suffered a really humiliating defeat in the 1962 Sino-Indian border war. For India, the bomb was fundamentally about national security and prestige vis-a-vis a much larger, now nuclear-armed neighbor. Then Pakistan, in turn, developed its nuclear capability almost entirely to deter India's overwhelming conventional military superiority. This pursuit actually led to China reportedly transferring a proven nuclear weapon design, and maybe even some fissile material, to Pakistan in the late 1980s to help them along.
So China helped Pakistan get the bomb to counter India, who got the bomb partly because of China.
Wow. It's a complex triangle, and a key difference in doctrine here is really important. Both China and India officially maintain no first-use policies. They say they'll only use nuclear weapons in retaliation. Pakistan, however, deliberately does not have a no first-use policy. Their nuclear doctrine explicitly contemplates first use of nuclear weapons to stop a large-scale conventional Indian invasion that threatens Pakistan's existence.
That sounds incredibly dangerous, a first-use doctrine.
It is inherently risky. Yet, despite that dangerous doctrinal difference, the second stability paradox seems to hold true here as well. The sources argue that, paradoxically, the proliferation of nuclear weapons to this volatile triangle has, on balance, enhanced strategic stability and essentially eliminated large-scale war between these three nuclear-armed states since they all acquired credible arsenals. Small border clashes continue, but another massive 1965 or 1971 style war, it hasn't happened.
Okay, so if proliferation, weirdly, seems to have brought a kind of tense stability to the Middle East and South Asia, why do the sources warn so strongly that the situation with Iran would be fundamentally different and much more dangerous?
Because Iran, or rather the nature of the Iranian regime, potentially challenges the fundamental prerequisite upon which nuclear deterrence rests.
Which is?
Which is the assumption of rationality, specifically the mutual desire for survival and the belief that preserving the nation state and the lives of its people is the highest priority. Experts widely agree that if Iran does develop a nuclear bomb, the resulting new triangle, Israel, Iran, and likely Saudi Arabia soon after, would be inherently unstable, unlike the others.
Why unstable? What's different about Iran?
The difference lies in Iran being a revolutionary theocracy. Its leadership structure, particularly tracing back to Ayatollah Khomeini and embodied today in parts of the Revolutionary Guard, has a track record of demonstrating an ideology where, frankly, the value of individual human life is not particularly important to them when weighed against the perceived needs of the revolution or religious destiny.
The sources cite specific examples, right?
Yes. The most often cited and chilling example is the regime's practice during the brutal Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s of sending waves of young, untrained volunteers, including literal child martyrs, across minefields to clear paths for tanks, often with plastic keys to paradise hung around their necks.
That kind of disregard for human life, it undermines the whole logic of deterrence, doesn't it? if your opponent doesn't fear death or destruction in the same way you do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It introduces a non-rational actor problem, or at least an actor operating under a drastically different rationality calculus. Classic deterrence theory, based on mutual assured destruction and the fear of annihilation, might simply not apply reliably in that context.
And this deep concern about the regime's nature was central to the whole debate around the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, wasn't it? What did the sources identify as the core failing of that agreement?
The core failing, from the perspective of long-term non-proliferation, was its limited duration. The JCPOA was primarily designed to push Iran's breakout time, the time it would need to produce enough fissile material for one bomb further into the future, maybe a year or more. But it fundamentally relied on temporary restrictions.
It was always just kicking the can down the road, as critics said.
Pretty much. Key restrictions on uranium enrichment levels, stockpile sizes, and advanced centrifuge development were all set to expire over time, often within 10 to 15 years. This meant that Iran would eventually, legally under the deal's terms, be free to pursue industrial-scale enrichment with advanced machines. It guaranteed the nuclear issue would inevitably return, perhaps with even greater urgency once those sunset clauses kicked in.
So given that ideological context and the temporary nature of the deal, the only way to achieve truly stable long-term control would have been what?
Probably an indefinite agreement with much more pervasive, intrusive inspections, the so-called anywhere, anytime access that Iran always resisted. Without addressing the long-port capability and the potential intent, the JCPOA was seen by critics less as a solution and more as a pause button.
Okay, so we've got an NPT system with serious flaws. We've got rational reasons why some countries pursue nukes. We've got potentially non-rational actors like Iran posing a unique danger.
Oh.
Where does that leave us in terms of actual policy? What credible alternatives do we even have?
Well, let's start by ruling out two of the most radical policy options, because the sources argue they're basically non-viable for the U.S. or its allies in most realistic scenarios. First is prevention. That means eliminating the threat before a nation acquires the actual capability. Think of Israel's strike on Iraq's Azraq reactor back in 1981.
Why isn't that viable more broadly?
It's just politically and militarily incredibly costly and difficult to sustain indefinitely against multiple potential proliferators. It risks massive diplomatic backlash, potential regional wars, and you have to be certain about their intentions and capabilities before they cross the line. It's rarely feasible. The second non-viable option is preemption. This means attacking after they've acquired the capability, but before they use it, trying to take out their arsenal in a surprise first strike.
That sounds like the definition of instability.
It absolutely is. Preemption demands an almost impossible standard. You need near 100% certainty that you can destroy all their warheads and delivery systems in one go, because even one surviving nuke could cause unacceptable devastation and retaliation. And you need absolutely unambiguous, timely intelligence that an attack from them is truly imminent.
Which is virtually impossible to guarantee.
Exactly. Relying on preemption as a policy basically puts you on a permanent hair trigger and is incredibly destabilizing. It invites miscalculation on all sides.
Okay, so if we can't reliably prevent acquisition and preemptive strikes are too dangerous and uncertain, the logical conclusion seems to be that we need a really effective defense, a shield. Yet, the critique in these sources, particularly from Postal, regarding the current U.S. missile defense system, the Ground-Based Midcourse Defense, or GMD, is absolutely devastating. Why is GMG considered inherently flawed?
Postal lays out the physics argument very clearly. GMD is designed to intercept an incoming warhead during its mid-course phase while it's coasting through the vacuum of space outside the atmosphere. The fundamental physics problem is this. In a vacuum, objects travel together at the same speed regardless of their weight or composition unless acted upon by an external force like thrust. A heavy nuclear warhead and a light, simple decoy follow the exact same ballistic trajectory.
So the interceptor can't tell them apart.
Not easily, especially with simple decoys. Imagine the warhead is released alongside a few lightweight, maybe mylar, balloons designed to mimic its general size or temperature signature in space. The GMD's kill vehicle, which uses infrared sensors to home in on the target, has no reliable way to distinguish the real heavy warhead from these simple, cheap, lightweight decoys. They all look like cold objects moving along the same path.
So the early tests of this concept, they failed.
According to Postal's analysis of the unclassified data, yes. The critical early proof-of-concept flight tests, specifically IFT-1A and IFT-2 back in the late 90s, failed to demonstrate that the system could reliably discriminate between a realistic warhead and credible decoys.
So if an adversary like North Korea just launches their warhead surrounded by, say, 24 simple balloon decoys.
The GMD interceptor, or interceptors, would essentially be firing blind into that cloud. The probability of actually hitting the real warhead becomes statistically negligible. You're easily overwhelmed.
What's truly shocking here, though, isn't just the technical flaw, but the institutional response described in the sources.
Yes. Postal documents, quite damningly, how institutions involved in the program, like MIT Lincoln Laboratory, allegedly concealed or misrepresented these fundamental discrimination failures to Congress and the public for years. He essentially accuses them of promulgating fraudulent science to keep the program funded.
20 years later, billions spent.
Yeah, and the argument is that the U.S. is still relying for homeland defense against ICBMs on a system whose core concept is not even based on sound science. It's a stark warning about technological exuberance and institutional interests overriding basic physics.
This is incredibly concerning. If GMD is fundamentally flawed against even simple countermeasures, is there any viable missile defense option presented in the sources? One that actually relies on proven physics and technology?
Yes, there is. And it goes back to tackling the missile much earlier in its flight. We return to the concept of boost phase intercept. This is the basis for the airborne patrol system concept, which was developed and advocated by physicists like Richard Garwin and Ted Postel.
Okay, explain how that would work. What are the mechanics, and why is hitting the missile during its boost phase the crucial difference?
The boost phase is that initial period right after launch when the missile's main rocket engines are still firing, actively pushing it up through the atmosphere and towards space. For a liquid-fueled ICBM like the Hwasong-15, this phase lasts maybe around 300 seconds, about 5 minutes.
What makes the missile vulnerable then?
Several things. First, it's accelerating relatively slowly compared to its later speed in space. Second, it hasn't deployed any decoys or countermeasures yet. Third, its bright, hot engine plume is incredibly visible against the cold background of the upper atmosphere or space, making it easy to detect and track with existing space-based infrared satellites. And fourth, it's still flying on a somewhat predictable trajectory before it fine-tunes its path for the target.
So how would the airborne patrol system attack it during this window?
The concept uses relatively large, long-endurance drones, potentially modified existing platforms like the big-wing MQ-9 Reaper, equipped with fast, agile interceptor missiles. These drones would patrol continuously just outside North Korean airspace, maybe over the Sea of Japan. As soon as our satellites detect an ICBM launch, the drones get the signal and fire their interceptors. Because the ICBM is still moving relatively slowly in boost phase and can't maneuver defensively yet, you can use proven existing interceptor technology, fast missiles with good divert capability to fly out and hit it with a very high probability of success.
And this uses existing tech: drones, satellites, fast interceptors.
Essentially, yes, the components exist. The challenge is integrating them into a reliable system and deploying it effectively. But the core physics is sound. It avoids the mid-course discrimination problem entirely by hitting the missile before it can deploy decoys. The argument is that this kind of boost phase system could be developed and deployed relatively quickly and offer a genuinely robust defense against a limited number of ICBMs, like the kind North Korea might launch at the U.S. mainland.
This whole discussion, from the history to the tech to the policy, it ultimately leads us back to that big idealistic question: what about abolition? Just getting rid of nuclear weapons entirely. It seems like the morally right goal, but the sources conclude that total abolition is actually structurally unstable. Why is that?
It sounds paradoxical again, doesn't it? But total abolition is considered structurally unstable for a couple of key reasons. First, it creates an absolutely enormous incentive for any country, even a currently stable one, to cheat. Imagine a world with 0 declared nuclear weapons. If just one nation secretly kept or quickly rebuilt a small arsenal, they would instantly gain overwhelming military and political leverage over every other non-nuclear state. The temptation to cheat would be immense.
And the verification needed to prevent that would have to be incredibly intrusive, probably impossibly so.
Exactly. But there's a deeper, darker irony, too. Eliminating nuclear weapons entirely, arguably makes the world safe again for massive, horrifying, large-scale conventional wars. Wars on the scale of World War I and World War II, which killed tens of millions.
Because the nuclear deterrent, however terrifying, has prevented major power wars.
That's the uncomfortable argument supported by the last 70-plus years of history. So, the core lesson the sources seem to draw isn't necessarily that we should aim for immediate total abolition, which might be unstable and even dangerous. Instead, the focus should be on managing the current reality much more effectively. We need to work harder to create credible alternatives to nuclear weapons so that nations like Israel, maybe India, Pakistan, even China back in the day, don't feel they have a perfectly rational reason from their perspective to develop nukes in the first place.
Things like that guaranteed international fuel supply you mentioned earlier. Or maybe stronger conventional defenses and alliances.
Exactly. Addressing the incentives for proliferation, strengthening the NPT by closing loopholes, developing verifiable defensive systems that work, managing the threat rather than banking on an unstable abolition.
So if we try to synthesize everything we've covered today, it seems the core conflict is that the very invention of nuclear weapons is just fundamentally incompatible with our current world system, the structure of independent sovereign nation-states acting in their own perceived self-interest.
That really sums it up. To survive the century without a major nuclear catastrophe, the argument goes, nations will ultimately have to be willing to delegate some crucial elements of their sovereignty, perhaps over sensitive fuel cycle technologies, as we discussed with the fuel bank idea. It implies needing a much stronger system of global law and, crucially, reliable enforcement mechanisms to regulate these incredibly dangerous technologies and prevent proliferation effectively. That's a huge leap from where we are now.
It really is.
Yeah.
So let's leave you, the listener, with this final, maybe provocative thought to wrestle with on your own. Given the absolutely horrific history of large-scale conventional warfare, those 80 million dead in World War II, the sheer destructive absurdity of the conventional firebombing campaigns we talked about, consider the deeply uncomfortable, dark irony. Nuclear weapons, arguably the greatest single existential threat to civilization, have simultaneously been perhaps the single most powerful factor in preventing another large-scale war between the major powers for over 6 decades now. What does that terrible, terrifying paradox tell you about the future of international relations? And if this nuclear peace is unsustainable or too dangerous, what kind of solution could possibly replace it? Thank you for submitting the incredibly detailed source material that allowed us to undertake this crucial deep dive today. We really appreciate it. We'll see you next time.